On a bluff overlooking the Hudson River in Irvington, New York, where the grand estates of America's white industrial aristocracy lined the shore like pearls on a necklace of privilege, there stands a mansion that should never have existed, a 34-room Italian Renaissance villa built of Indiana limestone and stucco that represents one of the most audacious acts of architectural defiance in American history. For Villa Lewaro was built in 1918 by Madam C.J. Walker, a black woman who had been born Sarah Breedlove in 1867 on a Louisiana cotton plantation to parents who had been enslaved, who had worked as a washerwoman earning barely $1 a day, who had suffered poverty and abuse and loss that would have crushed most people, but who had through sheer will and business genius built a cosmetics empire that made her the wealthiest self-made woman in America and possibly the first female self-made millionaire of any race, and who used her fortune to build a mansion among the estates of the Rockefellers and the Goulds and the Vanderbilts, claiming her place in a landscape that had been designed to exclude people who looked like her, and the mansion's very existence was an act of revolution, was architectural declaration that black excellence could not be contained, that Jim Crow laws and social prejudice and economic discrimination could not prevent a formerly enslaved woman's daughter from living in a palace that rivaled anything owned by white millionaires, but the tragedy, the profound and haunting tragedy that echoes through Villa Lewaro's rooms and terraces and gardens, is that Madam Walker lived in her mansion for less than 2 years before her death in 1919, that she barely had time to enjoy what she had built, that the enormous effort and expensive construction consumed her energy and her health during the final years of her life, that the mansion she created as symbol of triumph became also symbol of sacrifice, and that Villa Lewaro, though it represented everything she had achieved, also represented everything she had lost in achieving it, and the central question that haunts this building, that demands we confront uncomfortable truths about ambition and cost and the price of proving oneself in a society designed to deny your humanity, is this: did the mansion consume Madam Walker as surely as she created it? Did the effort of building and maintaining this monument to black success literally kill her? Did her determination to claim space in white America's most exclusive landscape demand sacrifices that no one should have to make? And what does it mean that the greatest architectural achievement of one of America's most remarkable entrepreneurs became also her tomb, for she died before she could truly inhabit the palace she built, died with her revolutionary work incomplete, died having achieved unimaginable success but also having paid unimaginable price, and Villa Lewaro stands today as monument to both triumph and tragedy, to both what was possible and what was lost in pursuing that possibility, and to understand the full weight of this contradiction, to feel the power and the pain embedded in this building's stones, we must begin not with the mansion but with the woman, with Sarah Breedlove's origins in the Mississippi Delta, where she was born on the same plantation where her parents had been enslaved, where she picked cotton as a child, where she was orphaned by age 7, married by 14 to escape abusive household, widowed by 20 with a young daughter to support, and where she worked as washerwoman in St. Louis earning wages that barely sustained survival, and it was here, in conditions of grinding poverty that would have seemed to offer no escape, that Sarah began experimenting with hair care products, began developing treatments for the scalp ailments that afflicted many black women whose hair had been damaged by harsh chemicals and poor nutrition and the stresses of lives lived under oppression, and she discovered that she had not just talent for developing effective products but genius for business, for marketing, for understanding what black women needed and wanted, and for creating system of door-to-door sales that employed thousands of black women as Walker agents who earned unprecedented income selling her products, and by 1910, having married Charles Joseph Walker and adopted the name Madam C.J. Walker that would become her brand. Having moved her operations to Indianapolis where she built factory and training school, she was earning income that put her among America's wealthiest individuals, and she was using that wealth not just for personal comfort but for political activism, for philanthropy supporting black institutions and causes, for employing and training black women who had few other economic opportunities, and for proving through her own success that racist ideologies about black inferiority were lies. And every dollar she earned was victory over the system that had enslaved her parents, every business success was refutation of the segregation that sought to confine black ambition, and the decision to build Villa Lewaro represented culmination of this trajectory, represented her determination to claim not just economic success but social recognition, to live not just comfortably but magnificently, to occupy space that white society had declared off limits to black people regardless of their wealth or achievement. And she chose Irvington deliberately, chose to build among estates owned by families whose fortunes had often been built on exploitation of black labor, whose social world absolutely excluded black people except as servants, whose sense of superiority depended on maintaining rigid racial hierarchies, and she hired Vertner Tandy, one of the first registered black architects in New York State, to design a mansion that would be unmistakably grand, unmistakably expensive, unmistakably equal to anything white millionaires had built, and the result was Villa Lewaro, named using syllables from her daughter Lelia Walker Robinson's name, a 34-room Italian villa with music room and library and conservatory, with gold-leaf piano and organ, with Louis XVI furniture and paintings and sculptures, with terraces overlooking the Hudson and formal gardens designed by landscape architects, with every detail chosen to communicate wealth and taste and cultural sophistication. And the construction process itself was statement, was act of claiming space, was insistence that she had as much right to this landscape as any Rockefeller or Vanderbilt, and white neighbors were appalled, made their racism explicit in complaints and social ostracism, made clear that no matter how wealthy she became she would never be accepted, that the color line was boundary her money could not cross, and this must have hurt, must have been profound disappointment for a woman who had achieved so much and who was being told that achievement meant nothing in face of racial prejudice, but she refused to retreat, refused to acknowledge that anyone had right to determine where she could live, and she moved into Villa Lewaro in 1918 and began entertaining, hosting parties for black intellectuals and activists and artists, creating salon where Harlem Renaissance figures gathered, using her mansion as space for political organizing and cultural celebration, and this was revolutionary, was creation of black social space in landscape designed to exclude black presence except in service roles, was assertion that black wealth and black culture and black intellectual life deserved recognition and respect, and Villa Lewaro became not just her home but became symbol for thousands of black Americans who saw in it proof that racial barriers could be challenged, that success was possible even in system designed to prevent it, that black people could create beauty and luxury and cultural sophistication that equaled anything white society produced, but the cost of all this, the physical and emotional toll of building and maintaining Villa Lewaro while simultaneously running her business empire and conducting her political activism and fighting against the constant assault of racism, was immense, was consuming her health and energy, for Madam Walker suffered from hypertension that her doctors warned was dangerous, suffered from stress-related ailments that reflected the impossible burdens she carried, and her doctors urged her to slow down, to rest, to reduce the pressures on her system, but she could not or would not, continued pushing herself, continued building her business and her activism and her mansion, continued trying to prove through achievement what should never have required proof, that she was human being deserving of respect and dignity and space, and in May 1919, barely a year after moving into Villa Lewaro, at age 51, Madam C.J. Walker died of kidney failure related to hypertension, died in her mansion having barely begun to enjoy it, died with so much still to do. So many dreams still unrealized, so much unfinished business in her revolutionary work. And her death raises agonizing questions about costs of resistance, about price of breaking barriers, about what it demands of people who fight systems designed to crush them, for would Madam Walker have lived longer if she had accepted more modest ambitions, if she had not pushed herself so hard, if she had not taken on burden of building Villa Lewaro during her final years, and the answer is we cannot know but we must ask. Must confront possibility that the mansion she built as symbol of triumph contributed to her death, that the effort of claiming space among white millionaires consumed energy and health she could not afford to spend, that the determination to prove herself equal demanded sacrifices that hastened her death, and this is tragedy not just personal but structural, not just about one woman's choices but about what racist society demands of those who resist it, about how the burden of proving one's humanity, of fighting for recognition and respect that should be given freely, extracts costs that those who never have to prove themselves cannot imagine, and Villa Lewaro embodies this tragedy, stands as monument to both achievement and loss, to both what Madam Walker accomplished and what accomplishing it cost her, and after her death the mansion passed to her daughter Lelia, who continued using it for entertaining and political organizing but who also struggled with the enormous expense of maintaining such a property, struggled with property taxes and upkeep costs and the challenges of running a palace during the economic difficulties of the 1920s and early 1930s, and Lelia died in 1931, and Villa Lewaro was sold, passed through various owners, served for period as retirement home, fell into disrepair as maintenance costs made it increasingly difficult to sustain, and by late 20th century was deteriorating, was facing possible demolition, was at risk of being lost entirely, and this decline paralleled broader erasure of Madame Walker's legacy, for despite her revolutionary achievements she was being forgotten, her story was not taught in schools, her contributions to black economic empowerment and political activism were not widely recognized, and Villa Lewaro was crumbling physical evidence of this historical amnesia, and it was only through efforts of historian Emilia Bundles, Madame Walker's great-great-granddaughter, who wrote biography and advocated for preservation, and through work of preservationists who recognized building's historical significance, that Villa Lewaro was saved, was purchased in 2018 by New Voices Foundation dedicated to preserving and interpreting it, was stabilized and restored and is being developed as historic site and educational center, and this preservation represents reclamation, represents insistence that Madame Walker's story matters, that her achievements deserve recognition, that black history and black success and black contributions to America must be preserved and taught. And Villa Lewaro is being restored not as monument to wealth for its own sake but as site for understanding the barriers Madame Walker broke, the costs she paid, the revolution she embodied, and the ongoing struggle for racial justice and economic equality that her life represented, and this transformation from private mansion to educational site mirrors transformations at other estates but carries particular significance because Villa Lewaro was always political, was always statement about race and power and who deserves space and recognition, was always challenge to white supremacy and segregation, and its preservation and interpretation represent continuation of Madame Walker's revolutionary work, represent ongoing resistance to erasure and marginalization, represent insistence that black stories and black achievements and black struggles must be central to how we understand American history, and the questions Villa Lewaro raises about the costs of resistance, about what it demands of those who break barriers, about the physical and emotional toll of fighting systems designed to crush you, about whether achievement that requires such sacrifice is truly victory or is also tragedy. These questions remain urgent because the conditions that made Villa Lewaro necessary, the racism, the discrimination, the barriers to black advancement, the necessity for black people to prove their humanity and worth, have not been fully eliminated, have evolved but persist, continue to extract costs from those who challenge them, and Villa Lewaro's interpretation must grapple with this complexity, must tell Madame Walker's story in ways that celebrate her achievements while also acknowledging the costs, that recognize her genius and determination while also confronting the injustice of a society that made such extraordinary effort necessary, that honor her legacy while also using it to illuminate ongoing struggles. An early indication suggests that New Voices Foundation understands this responsibility, is committed to interpretation that centers racial justice, that acknowledges both triumph and tragedy, that uses Villa Lewaro as space for education about entrepreneurship and activism and the costs of fighting racism, and that recognizes the mansion as monument not just to one woman but to all the black people who have struggled against systems designed to deny their humanity and limit their possibilities. And this interpretation must also address the invisible labor that maintained Villa Lewaro, the black domestic workers who cleaned and cooked and maintained the mansion, whose names we largely do not know but whose labor was essential to the estate's operation, and this creates interesting complexity because unlike at white-owned estates where servants were exploited workers in hierarchical system, at Villa Lewaro the servants were part of black community, were employed by black woman who had herself worked in domestic service, who understood their labor from inside, and who paid them well by standards of the time, and this complicates simple narratives about class and exploitation, suggests that even as Madame Walker challenged racial hierarchies she existed within class hierarchies, that her mansion required domestic labor that reproduced some of the inequalities she had experienced. An honest interpretation must grapple with this complexity, must acknowledge that revolutionary figures are never perfect, that challenging one form of oppression does not automatically mean challenging all forms, and that Villa Lewaro's story includes questions about class as well as race, about domestic labor even in black-owned household, about the limits and contradictions of individual success within capitalist system, and these are difficult questions without easy answers, but asking them is necessary for honest reckoning with history, and Villa Lewaro, if interpreted with full complexity, can become space where these questions are explored, where visitors are challenged to think about multiple forms of inequality and how they intersect, about what individual achievement can and cannot accomplish, about the relationship between personal success and collective liberation, and about whether creating space for elite black individuals within existing class structure represents progress or represents accommodation to system that should be fundamentally transformed, and these are not merely historical questions but are urgently contemporary, are at heart of ongoing debates within black communities and broader progressive movements about strategy and goals, about whether the objective is inclusion within existing structures or transformation of those structures, about whether we should celebrate black billionaires as evidence of progress or critique them as evidence that capitalism continues to concentrate wealth regardless of race, and Villa Lewaro cannot answer these questions but can provide historical context for thinking about them, can show that tensions between individual achievement and collective struggle, between accommodation and resistance, between celebrating success within system and questioning that system, have long history, and that Madam Walker herself embodied these tensions, was both revolutionary challenger of racism and successful entrepreneur within capitalism, was both advocate for systemic change and beneficiary of existing economic structures, was both victim of exploitation and employer of domestic labor, and understanding her in full complexity, acknowledging her achievements while also questioning some of her choices and limitations, is more honest and ultimately more useful than simple celebration, and this complexity should extend to how we interpret the mansion itself, to how we present its architecture and furnishings and grounds, for Villa Lewaro is beautiful, is architecturally significant, represents taste and sophistication that deserve appreciation, but this beauty was created at enormous personal cost to Madam Walker, was built during final years of her life when she should have been resting, consumed resources that might have been used for other purposes, and functioned as what she herself might have called defensive architecture, mansion built not primarily for pleasure but as shield against prejudice, as proof of worth, as architectural argument against racism, and there is both power and tragedy in this, both triumph and defeat in needing to build palace to prove humanity, and visitors should understand this duality, should see Villa Lewaro as both magnificent achievement and exhausting burden, should recognize that for all its beauty it also represented enormous pressure, represented the weight of representing entire race, represented the crushing expectations placed on those who break barriers, and should prompt reflection on whether we should celebrate barrier breakers without also acknowledging the injustice of barriers existing in first place, without recognizing that forcing people to work twice as hard to achieve half as much is not victory but is continuing oppression, and Villa Lewaro's interpretation must make this visible. Must help visitors understand that Madam Walker's individual success, however remarkable, did not eliminate structural racism, did not change the conditions that made her achievements necessary, and that celebrating her without working to dismantle the systems she fought is not truly honoring her legacy, and this brings us to Villa Lewaro's contemporary significance, to why this building matters now, to what it can teach us about wealth and race and gender and the ongoing struggles for justice and equality, for Villa Lewaro stands at intersection of multiple forms of inequality and resistance, represents black woman's challenge to racism and sexism and class exclusion, embodies both the possibilities and the limitations of individual achievement within oppressive systems, and serves as reminder that progress is never complete, that each generation must continue the work, that the barriers Madam Walker broke have not stayed broken but have been rebuilt in new forms, and that her revolutionary vision of black economic empowerment and political activism remains urgent and necessary, and the mansion itself, preserved and restored and being developed as educational site, represents opportunity to tell more complex and honest stories about American history, to center black experiences and achievements that have been marginalized, to acknowledge costs of fighting racism that are rarely discussed, to explore intersections of race and class and gender, to question narratives of individual success that obscure structural inequality, and to connect historical struggles to contemporary movements for justice, and whether Villa Lewaro fulfills this potential depends on choices being made now about interpretation and programming and whose voices are centered, about whether the site becomes primarily tourist attraction showcasing beautiful mansion or becomes educational space challenging visitors to think critically about history and its legacies, about whether it celebrates Madam Walker in ways that are comfortable or in ways that are challenging, and Early indications suggest commitment to more challenging approach, to centering racial justice and honest complexity, but realizing this fully will require sustained effort and resources and willingness to tell difficult truths, and it will require resisting pressures toward simplification and celebration that characterize much heritage tourism, resisting tendency to present beautiful buildings without adequately confronting what they represent, resisting desire for comfortable narratives that do not challenge visitors' assumptions or contemporary power structures, and if Villa Lewaro can resist these pressures, if it can become space for genuine reckoning with history and its meanings, if it can honor Madame Walker's complexity while using her story to illuminate broader struggles, then it can serve purposes far beyond preserving one building, can become model for how to interpret sites associated with marginalized communities, can demonstrate that historic preservation can serve social justice rather than merely celebrating past elites, and can show that buildings, when honestly interpreted, can become tools for education and transformation rather than simply monuments to achievement, and this is Villa Lewaro's potential, this is what it can become, and this is why its preservation and interpretation matter. Why the granite mansion that consumed a millionaire can teach us about costs of resistance and about ongoing struggle for justice, and why Madame C.J. Walker's truncated triumph in that mansion remains relevant to contemporary fights against racism and inequality, for she showed both what is possible and what it costs, both how barriers can be broken and how breaking them can break the breaker, both how individual success can challenge systems and how systems can survive individual challenges, and Villa Lewaro, standing on its bluff overlooking the Hudson, beautiful and haunting, monument to triumph and tomb of revolutionary, represents all of this. Complexity, embodies all these contradictions, demands we hold multiple truths simultaneously, and stands finally as testament to remarkable woman who refused to accept the limitations racism and sexism and poverty tried to impose, who built business empire and political movement and architectural monument, who died too young having achieved too much at too great a cost, and whose legacy challenges us to continue the work she began, to fight the systems she fought, to question whether individual success within unjust system is sufficient or whether we must pursue collective liberation and structural transformation, and to understand that preserving her mansion means not just maintaining building but maintaining her revolutionary vision, her insistence on dignity and respect and space for Black people, her commitment to economic empowerment and political activism, her belief that Black women deserved everything they could achieve, and her determination to prove through her own life that no barrier was insurmountable even if breaking through cost everything she had, and to understand Villa Lewaro's full architectural significance, to appreciate how Vertner Tandy's design embodied Madame Walker's vision of claiming equal status with white millionaires, we must examine the building's details, must look at how every choice of material and style and ornament was calculated to communicate wealth and sophistication and cultural literacy. For the Italian Renaissance style was not accidental selection but was deliberate invocation of European architectural tradition that American elites used to legitimize their wealth, was style associated with Medici palaces and Venetian villas, with old money and cultural refinement, and by building in this style Madame Walker was asserting that Black wealth deserved the same architectural expression as white wealth, that her success entitled her to the same symbols of status and prestige, and Tandy's design featured Indiana limestone that gave the building's exterior weight and permanence, that communicated this was not temporary structure but enduring monument, featured stucco detailing and terra cotta ornaments and a red tile roof that evoked Italian villas, featured symmetrical facade with central entrance and balanced windows that followed classical proportions, and the interior spaces were arranged according to conventions of elite American houses, with grand entrance hall opening to music room on one side and library on the other, with formal dining room and sun room and conservatory for plants, with second floor containing bedroom suites and sitting rooms, with third floor devoted to servants' quarters, and this spatial arrangement itself encoded social hierarchies, reflected expectations about how wealthy people lived and how their houses should be organized. And Madame Walker and Tandy followed these conventions not because they necessarily agreed with the values they represented but because deviation from them would have been read as ignorance or lack of sophistication, would have undermined the mansion's purpose of proving that Black wealth was equivalent to white wealth, and this highlights cruel paradox of Villa Lewaro, highlights how even acts of resistance can require conformity, how challenging racism required adopting architectural language developed by and for white elites, how proving equality meant accepting standards and aesthetics imposed by those who denied that equality. And there is both power and constraint in this, both agency and limitation in choosing to compete within system rather than rejecting its terms entirely, and the interior details reinforced this strategy of claiming equal status through equivalent display, for Madame Walker filled Villa Lewaro with expensive furnishings that demonstrated her wealth and taste, with Louis XVI chairs and tables purchased from established dealers, with paintings and sculptures chosen to suggest cultural sophistication, with gold leaf St organ that cost thousands of dollars and that was centerpiece of the music room where she hosted performances, with Victrola phonograph and extensive record collection, with library containing hundreds of books including works by black authors but also classical literature and contemporary bestsellers, and these possessions were not merely functional but were carefully curated to communicate specific messages about education and refinement and belonging to cultured classes, and the gardens surrounding the mansion extended this project of creating a state equivalent to those of white neighbors, for landscape architects designed terraced gardens with ornamental plantings and pathways, with views carefully framed to showcase the Hudson River and the Palisades beyond, with spaces for outdoor entertaining and for contemplative walking. And these gardens placed Villa Lewaro within tradition of Hudson River estates that had been developed throughout the 19th century by industrialists and financiers who built country seats where they could escape New York City and entertain in settings that displayed their wealth through controlled nature, and Madame Walker's gardens claimed her right to same luxury, same relationship to landscape, same ability to command nature as backdrop for leisured living, and every detail of Villa Lewaro, from the stonework to the gardens to the furnishings to the name itself, worked to establish equivalence with white wealth, to insist that black achievement deserved equal recognition. And this was revolutionary precisely because American racism insisted on inequality regardless of achievement, insisted that black people were inherently inferior and could never be equal to whites no matter what they accomplished, and Villa Lewaro's very existence refuted this ideology, proved through material reality that black people could create and appreciate beauty and luxury, could build monuments to success that rivaled anything white people created, and the mansion functioned as three-dimensional argument against racism, as architectural proof that racist ideology was lie, and yet, and this is crucial complexity. This proof was necessary only because racism existed, this argument had to be made only because white supremacy denied black humanity, and Villa Lewaro's magnificence was therefore both triumph over racism and evidence of racism's power, was both victory and burden, and Madame Walker herself seemed to understand this duality, seemed to recognize that her mansion was both achievement and trap, for she wrote to friends about the pleasure the house gave her but also about the exhaustion of maintaining it, about the satisfaction of proving herself equal but also about the weight of representing entire race, about the joy of creating beautiful space but also about the isolation of living among hostile white neighbors, and these contradictions were not resolvable within her lifetime and perhaps are not resolvable even now. For as long as racism persists, the question of whether to seek inclusion within existing structures or to build alternative structures remains contested. The question of whether individual achievement within oppressive system represents progress or accommodation remains debated, and Villa Lewaro embodies these unresolved tensions, stands as monument to questions that each generation must answer anew, and the mansion's role in black intellectual and cultural life during Madame Walker's lifetime and afterward adds another dimension to its significance. For Villa Lewaro became gathering place for figures who would shape the Harlem Renaissance, became salon where writers and artists and activists met and exchanged ideas, where W.E.B. Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson and other leaders of black political and cultural movements came to discuss strategy and to enjoy hospitality that few other spaces could offer, and this function was central to Madame Walker's vision for the mansion, was not secondary to its purpose as symbol of success but was integral to that purpose, for she understood that black achievement required not just individual success but collective organization, required institutions and networks and spaces where black people could gather beyond white surveillance and control, and Villa Lewaro provided such space, provided setting where black intellectuals could meet as equals of any white intellectuals, where conversations about black liberation and cultural production could happen in surroundings that affirmed black capability and potential. And after Madame Walker's death, her daughter Lelia, who took the name Lelia Walker and who was herself prominent figure in Harlem Renaissance social world, continued and expanded this tradition, hosting legendary parties at Villa Lewaro and at her Harlem townhouse, bringing together black artists and white patrons and intellectuals from around the world, creating spaces that were racially integrated in ways that were rare and remarkable for the 1920s. And A'Lelia Walker's parties became famous for their glamour and their mixing of different social worlds, for their celebration of black culture and their challenge to segregation, and Villa Lewaro was crucial site for these gatherings, provided setting that legitimized black cultural production by framing it within architecture of wealth and sophistication, and this cultural role makes Villa Lewaro significant not just as Madam Walker's house but as important site in development of 20th-century black arts and letters, as space where Harlem Renaissance was partially incubated and nurtured. And preserving and interpreting Villa Lewaro must therefore include this cultural history, must tell stories not just of Madam Walker but of the networks and movements that gathered there, must recognize the mansion as collective space even though it was privately owned, and this cultural significance also raises questions about access and who got to enjoy Villa Lewaro during its years as private residence, for while the Walkers hosted many guests and supported many causes, the mansion was still exclusive space, was not accessible to most black Americans, served primarily elite networks of black intellectuals and professionals, and this reflects class stratification within black communities, reflects reality that even as Madam Walker challenged racism she existed within class system that created hierarchies among black people, that separated educated professionals and successful entrepreneurs from working class and poor black people. An honest interpretation of Villa Lewaro must acknowledge this class dimension, must recognize that the mansion represented aspirations that were available to very few, that its grandeur could inspire but could also alienate, that it was simultaneously monument to possibility and reminder of inequality, and these tensions between individual achievement and collective struggle, between elite spaces and mass movements, between integration into existing structures and creation of alternative institutions, were central to debates within black communities throughout 20th century and remain central today, and Villa Lewaro can serve as site for exploring these tensions, for understanding their historical roots and their contemporary manifestations, for recognizing that questions about strategy and goals and the relationship between personal success and collective liberation have no simple answers but require ongoing dialogue and debate. And the mansion's history after the Walker family sold it in 1930s adds further layers of meaning and raises additional questions about memory and preservation and whose stories get told, for Villa Lewaro passed through several owners who were not connected to Madam Walker's legacy, who bought the property for its architectural merit or its location but not for its historical significance, and during these decades the mansion's connection to Madam Walker began to fade from public consciousness, began to be forgotten except by historians and by Walker family descendants. And the building itself deteriorated as the enormous costs of maintaining such a large estate exceeded owners' resources or willingness to invest, and by late 20th century Villa Lewaro was in serious disrepair, was in danger of being demolished or of deteriorating beyond possibility of restoration, and this physical decline paralleled broader erasure of Madam Walker from mainstream American historical narrative, for despite her extraordinary achievements she was not included in most history textbooks, was not taught about in schools, was not recognized in national monuments or memorials, and this erasure was not accidental but was result of whose stories were considered important, whose achievements were deemed worthy of remembering, and the systematic marginalization of black history and black contributions meant that even figures as remarkable as Madam Walker could be forgotten, and Villa Lewaro's deterioration was physical manifestation of this forgetting, was evidence of how historical amnesia operates not just in what we fail to teach but in what we fail to preserve, and the mansion might have been lost entirely if not for efforts of A'Lelia Bundles, Madam Walker's great-great-granddaughter, who became historian and biographer and advocate for preserving her ancestors' legacy, who wrote books that brought Madam Walker's story to wider public, who worked with preservationists and historians to document Villa Lewaro's significance, and who fought for decades to ensure that the building would be saved and that Madam Walker's achievements would be recognized. And Bundles' work represents form of historical rescue, represents insistence that black stories matter and must be told, represents resistance to erasure that has affected so much of black history, and her success in raising awareness about Madam Walker and Villa Lewaro contributed to renewed interest in the site and ultimately to its purchase by New Voices Foundation in 2018, and this purchase marked turning point, marked shift from private residence to historical site intended for public education, marked beginning of preservation and restoration that aims to stabilize building and interpret its significance, and New Voices Foundation's vision for Villa Lewaro emphasizes using the site to tell stories about entrepreneurship and activism and the costs of fighting racism, about Black women's economic and political contributions, about Harlem Renaissance and Black cultural production, and about ongoing struggles for racial justice. And this interpretive approach represents best practices in heritage preservation that seek to complicate simple narratives, to acknowledge difficult truths, to center voices of marginalized communities, and to connect historical sites to contemporary issues, and if realized fully this approach could make Villa Lewaro model for how to interpret sites associated with Black history, could demonstrate that preservation can serve education and social justice rather than merely celebrating past, but realizing this vision requires substantial resources, requires funding for restoration and interpretation and programming, requires expertise in both historic preservation and in Black history and in educational design, requires community engagement to ensure that interpretation serves needs of Black communities and tells stories in ways that are accurate and respectful, and requires sustained commitment over many years. For transforming deteriorated mansion into functioning educational site is enormous undertaking that cannot be accomplished quickly or cheaply, and there are challenges beyond the physical and financial. Challenges of how to tell Madam Walker's story in ways that honor her complexity, that celebrate her achievements without sanitizing her limitations, that acknowledge the costs she paid without suggesting that those costs were necessary or justified, that recognize her revolutionary impact while also questioning whether individual success within capitalist system represents adequate response to structural racism. And these interpretive challenges require careful thought and broad consultation. Require willingness to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, require resisting both the tendency to heroize without questioning and the tendency to critique without appreciating, and early programming at Villa Lewaro suggests that these challenges are being taken seriously, that interpretation is being developed in consultation with historians and community members, that multiple voices are being included in telling the site's stories, and that the goal is genuinely educational rather than merely celebratory. And this is encouraging because historic sites too often become monuments to simplified past, become places where complex people are reduced to heroes or villains, where structural forces are ignored in favor of individual narratives, where difficult questions are avoided in preference for comfortable answers, and if Villa Lewaro can avoid these pitfalls, if it can become space for genuine engagement with complexity and ambiguity and ongoing struggle, then it can serve purposes far beyond preserving one building, and comparing Villa Lewaro to other historic sites helps illuminate what makes it distinctive and what its preservation and interpretation can contribute to broader landscape of American heritage, for there are many mansion museums in United States, many estates built by wealthy Americans that are now open to public, but relatively few of these were built by Black people, relatively few tell stories centered on experiences of marginalized communities. And most mansion museums, even those that attempt to address issues of race and class and labor, still primarily celebrate the wealthy families who built them, still present stories of success and achievement without adequately confronting the exploitation and inequality that made that success possible, and Villa Lewaro has opportunity to be different, has opportunity to center rather than marginalize questions of race and racism, has opportunity to tell story that is not primarily about individual success but about structural barriers and collective struggle, has opportunity to use mansion as lens for understanding American history in ways that challenge dominant narratives, and this opportunity exists because Madam Walker's story is inherently about resistance and because her success cannot be understood apart from the racism she fought, cannot be celebrated without confronting the society that made her achievements necessary. And this distinguishes Villa Lewaro from mansions built by white elites whose success is typically presented as evidence of individual merit, rather than as product of systemic advantages, and the challenge for Villa Lewaro's interpretation is to maintain this critical edge, to resist pressures toward celebratory simplification, to insist on telling complicated truths even when those truths are uncomfortable, and to use the site not just to commemorate past but to educate about present, to connect Madam Walker's struggles to ongoing fights for racial justice, to show continuities between historical and contemporary racism, to explore how barriers have evolved but persist, and to inspire visitors not just to admire Walker's achievements but to commit themselves to continuing the work of dismantling systems of oppression, and this kind of interpretation is difficult, requires more than traditional museum displays and guided tours, requires programming that engages visitors actively, that prompts reflection and dialogue, that connects historical content to visitors' own experiences and contexts, and that provides tools for understanding how historical forces shape contemporary conditions, and New Voices Foundation's plans for Villa Lewaro include educational programs for students, professional development for teachers, public programs exploring entrepreneurship and activism, and partnerships with community organizations, and these programs have potential to make the site genuinely transformative educational space, to reach audiences beyond typical museum visitors, to serve Black communities in ways that honor Madam Walker's legacy of economic empowerment and political organizing, and to contribute to broader movements for racial justice by grounding contemporary activism in historical understanding, and whether this potential is realized depends on many factors including sustained funding and community support and skilled interpretation and willingness to take risks in programming. But the foundation has been laid for Villa Lewaro to become something more than beautiful building, to become living site that continues Madam Walker's revolutionary work, and the ultimate question that Villa Lewaro poses to us, to contemporary Americans grappling with persistent racism and growing inequality and ongoing struggles for justice, is what we owe to people like Madam Walker who broke barriers at enormous personal cost, what responsibility we have to continue the work they began, whether we honor their legacies through celebration or through action, whether preserving their houses is sufficient or whether we must also preserve and advance their visions of justice, and Villa Lewaro demands we confront these questions because the building itself is monument to both achievement and sacrifice, to both what one extraordinary person accomplished and what that accomplishment cost, to both the possibilities of resistance and the toll resistance exacts, and standing in that mansion, walking through rooms where Madam Walker entertained and organized and dreamed, looking out over Hudson River from terraces she barely had time to enjoy. We must feel the weight of her sacrifice, must recognize that she should not have had to work so hard, should not have had to prove her humanity through wealth, should not have had to build palace to be treated with basic respect and dignity, and we must ask whether we are building a world where such proofs are no longer necessary, where people's worth is not measured by their wealth, where racial justice is not prized to be won through individual achievement but is right to be guaranteed through structural transformation, and if we are not building such world, then we are failing Madam Walker's legacy, are reducing her to symbol of individual success rather than honoring her as revolutionary who fought for collective liberation, are celebrating her achievements while ignoring the conditions that made those achievements both necessary and costly, and Villa Lewaro, properly interpreted, will not let us make this mistake, will insist that we understand both the triumph and the tragedy, will demand that we grapple with complexity and contradiction, will challenge us to think critically about what progress means and what justice requires, and will stand as permanent reminder that breaking barriers is not sufficient if barriers remain to be broken, that individual success within oppressive system is not victory if system persists, that celebrating past achievements is not substitute for present action, and that the mansion overlooking the Hudson, beautiful and haunting, monument to extraordinary woman who died too young having achieved too much at too great a cost, demands not just our admiration but our commitment, not just our memory but our action, not just our tears for what was lost but our determination to build a world where such losses are no longer necessary, where Black people and all marginalized people can thrive without having to prove themselves, can build whatever they choose to build without carrying weight of representation, can live where they choose without facing hostility and exclusion, can rest when they need to rest without feeling they must constantly push harder to justify their existence, and where mansions, if they are built at all, are built for joy rather than for defense, for pleasure rather than for proof, and where Sarah Breedlove's daughter could have lived in Villa Lewaro for decades rather than months, could have enjoyed the beauty she created rather than being consumed by the effort of creating it, could have died old and satisfied rather than young and exhausted, and this is the world Madam C.J. Walker worked toward. This is the revolution Villa Lewaro represented, and this is the unfinished work that her mansion, preserved and interpreted and transformed into space for education and organizing and dreaming of better future, calls us to complete.